in recent years, we have started to talk more openly about child sexual abuse and the impact that it can have on the people who experience it and those around them. But when we think about the perpetrators, we probably think of them as being adults, pedophile priests, teachers, family members. But for kids that have been sexually abused by other children, the consequences can be just as profound and much harder to recognise for those around them and even for themselves to recognise. Our panellist, Shannon Molloy, has embarked on a deeply personal investigation of this subject in his new book. It's called You Made Me This Way, and in it he speaks to male child sexual abuse survivors as well as drawing on his own experience as a child. In this extract from the book, Shannon reveals the moment that he confronted some traumatic memories during a session with his psychiatrist and began to understand what had really happened to him as a young boy.
Once I start speaking about it, I can't stop. The dam is broken. Even though it feels like I'm regurgitating a razor blade, something inside of my soul knows this is long overdue. I tell Dr. Rollenstein about how it started. I relive that day in Joshua's bedroom. I tell him about the second time it happened. I tell him how it happened a third time and a fourth, and about how I eventually lost count. My memory doesn't really hold specific accounts of the times beyond that third or fourth encounter, just little snippets. I pause and look up at Dr. Rollenstein, who's sitting quietly and staring at me. These kinds of feelings, these kinds of challenges, they're not uncommon with people who've been sexually abused. I jolt upright. The sudden movement startles him and he shuffles back in his seat. He can see that I'm instantly uncomfortable.
Shannon, just as you were shocked at that moment to have a professional describe what had happened in your life as sexual abuse, I imagine quite a lot of people watching tonight would be a little bit surprised to hear that the sexual touching of a 5-year-old by an 8-year-old is considered abuse. Sexual? Yes. But in what ways was it right to describe that as abusive? What were the behaviours and the other things that were going on that made it abuse?
Yeah, the things that I discovered, well, not just writing this book, but in therapy, was that there were elements of what happened to me that sort of put it into that abuse category. The power imbalance. I was 5, but a very young 5. He was 8, but quite a mature 8. The coercion and manipulation that took place, the threats, and just me very clearly not wanting to do that and wanting to run from that each time. But that what you just heard, that was the first time anyone had said those words to me, you know, abuse, this is abuse, this is what happens when you're abused. And I'd never thought about it that way before.
Had you thought about it in other ways? Was it something that was in your thoughts?
Oh yeah, the worst possible ways, that it was my fault somehow, that I was broken or disturbed, that, you know, this is just what happens to bad kids. Even as an adult, that's how I still thought about myself. In the same way that I thought about how it was when I was 5, that it was wrong and disgusting, and I very deeply disliked myself as a result.
Going through that process of therapy, how did it change your feelings, not just about yourself, but also the perpetrator of it? What feelings did that bring up?
I'd thought about it more times than I can possibly count. I'd never said it out loud before, and saying it for the first time to a therapist really helped me sort of put it in context and figure out a lot about why I am the way I am, and that inspired the book title in the end. While writing the book, I found this fellow. I hadn't seen him since I was maybe 12 or something. And we had a conversation about what he remembered, about what he felt in the moment, if he remembered, and where he is now. And that sort of, it was a very odd experience, very uncomfortable experience, but quite a cathartic one as well, because I, you know, didn't hate him quite as much anymore. We spoke a lot about, you know, the kind of horrible home life that he had, and that perhaps that had sort of sparked his own trauma and led him to do this thing. And so, yeah, it was quite a confronting experience, but a really therapeutic one as well.
That is often one of the hardest things for anyone who's experienced, whether it's sexual or other violence or other forms of abuse, that the perpetrator can themselves have been the target of abuse at some point, not as a way of explaining or justifying it, but just there is a correlation there. How did he feel about what he had done? Did he view it terribly differently to you, or was it something that he thought back on with shame?
Yeah, I think he felt a lot of shame as well. You know, he's gone on to have a good life and isn't a gay man, for example. He's got, you know, a great job and happy friendships, and this sort of has stuck with him since then in a similar way that it has to me, as this kind of guilt and shame. It's interesting in doing the work for this book that the professionals that are in this space and are at the front line still don't quite know how to deal with these instances of abuse when the perpetrator is also a minor, because it is a real grey area for not just those treating abuse victims and perpetrators who are children, but for the children themselves. And there's a lot tied up in that has lifelong consequences, as this book shows.
Yeah, your earlier book, 14, talked about your adolescence and the suicidality that you experienced at that time. Do you draw a direct line between those two, and in what other ways did those events when you were 5 affect you in your teens and your adult life?
I think I was probably a little less resilient to be able to cope with my adolescence. I was, you know, grew up gay in regional Queensland in the late 90s, as the only gay in the village when it was about the worst thing you could be. And so perhaps, you know, what happened to me made me a little less prepared for that. But in broader life, you know, I've had issues with anxiety and depression, some unhealthy relationships in my 20s. You know, drinking too much sometimes, enjoying the pokies more than someone should at times. Lots of issues that are very common with men who've been abused as children. It's, you know, the abuse occurs, but then what often occurs is silence after that. Most men don't tell anybody for the better part of 30 years, if at all. And the cost of that silence is finding your own way to cope, as I have. And that's never healthy. So this has had a huge, profound impact on me, as it has on the several men that I interviewed over the better part of a year.
Did you find that their experiences closely correlated to yours, or does it affect different people in different ways?
I really felt that, you know, we all came from very different backgrounds, some country, some city, some rich, some poor, some white, some not. But we all kind of found ourselves in very similar places and almost spoke the same language. And they had noticed that as well with the more men that they met, or going to support groups, for example. There was a lot of comfort in that, particularly for the men who, there were 2 in this book who have never told anyone else before they told me. There's a lot of comfort in sort of realising that, you know, this is why we are the way we are. Of course, there are, you know, more acute instances of trauma, but yeah, a lot of similarities.
Michael, I know that you've done a lot of very well-respected research in this area. Lots to ask you about. I guess first thing that occurs to me is, can you explain to us what are the legalities when we're dealing with 2 children, both under the age of consent, both under the age of legal responsibility? Does the law have a role here at all?
Look, probably about half of child sexual abuse is committed by minors, it's committed by children. And it's really been only in the last 10 years or so, I think, that we've come to understand the extent of that and the harms of that, and starting to articulate really clearly those distinctions that Shannon's making between kind of sexual play between kids, and at what point does it tip over into abuse, into developmentally inappropriate responses. You know, by and large, these are incidences that we don't, most of the time, we're not looking for a criminal justice pathway. What states and territories have done over the last 10 years is make significant investments in treatment services for children with sexually harmful behaviours. And, you know, Shannon's observed this in his own experience, but what we know is that for kids who use sexual violence, almost always there's exposure to domestic and family violence. That's probably one of the most common factors that we see in their background. Sometimes they've been sexually abused, but that in and of itself, sexual abuse is not necessarily a precipitator for this sort of behaviour. Family, domestic violence, fear, the perpetrating child is acting out a lot of really complex dynamics there, but it is really, really harmful. And we need to say that out loud. You know, we need to be really clear. Child-to-child sexual abuse is as harmful as adult perpetrated sexual abuse. It has the same effects, it has lifelong implications, and often we find many adult survivors are then left struggling with the meaning of what happened to them because it doesn't seem to fit into a neat box about how we understand sort of quote unquote real sexual abuse. And it absolutely is real sexual abuse.
How, for parents watching who, you know, a lot of parents are very anxious at any sign of sort of sexualisation of their children, but they also understand that kids do explore their bodies and bodies of friends, and there is that line that you talk about where it tips over into sexual abuse. But without a law that defines that line, how do you define it? How should we define it? How should we understand that?
For some of the forensic paediatricians that I work with, you know, one of the key defining characteristics of child-to-child sexual abuse is actually the secrecy. When children are engaged in sexual play, for example, you know, there's not a sense that they're necessarily doing anything wrong. They're not necessarily doing anything that they, you know, need to keep secret. What we find with child-to-child sexual abuse is, you know, children, the perpetrating child or the child that's engaging in harmful behaviour is saying, don't tell anyone, you know, this is your fault. And so we see the secrecy, we see the shame, for instance, and these are real red flags that what is going on is inappropriate. It's also where children are displaying sexual knowledge and sexual behaviour that is just beyond the realm of what could possibly be developmentally appropriate for a 5-year-old or for an 8-year-old. That's really starting to signal that there's something else that is going on here. Of course, you know, children have sexualised sorts of behaviours that are just a normal part of childhood, and we don't want to intrude into that, and we don't want to embarrass kids for engaging in normal sexual behaviour. But secrecy, shame, and one of the things that Shannon's, I think, identified really importantly is coercion, manipulation, you know, force. That's never okay. There's no scenario where that's okay, and it's not okay between kids.
Yeah. Shannon, I guess people will be wanting to know, how are you going now?
Yeah, great. And that's the one thing that I want people to take away from this conversation or the book, if they get it and read it, is that this is not a life sentence, despite the scary title and the heavy subject matter, that men who seek out help and ask for help live happy, great, full lives. There are tough days and tough weeks here and there, but treatment works. For parents with kids who are going through this, early intervention is extremely successful, but across the board, when you're not coping well with something, when you're struggling, asking for help is really, really important.
And was it difficult, important, cathartic for you to become a father yourself?
Yeah, a lot of scary thoughts about, you know, whether I was going to be any good at it. But yeah, it's been lovely. It's the most important thing I've ever done.
All right. Well done on this book. I imagine it was a difficult process to go through, but I hope it was a positive one. And do you sense that the men that you spoke to in this are also connecting with the services that they need?
Absolutely. There was one man who had never told anybody at all, had been in therapy for many years and never even had the confidence to bring it up to his therapist. And since talking with me over many, many hours and helping me with the book and then reading multiple versions of the book, he's told his partner and he's told his therapist, and he feels like he's in a really good place to finally start confronting this thing. So
well done, and thank you for the conversation tonight.
You.
If you've been affected by this discussion at all, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14. There's also 1-800-RESPECT, 1-800-737732.